The Grand Lecture Hall at NYU Stern School of Business was packed with eager students. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in New York City, and the room buzzed with conversation as young minds prepared for a thought-provoking session of philosophy and ethics in modern society. At the podium stood Professor Richard Callaway, a towering figure in the academic world, known for his sharp wit, unshakable atheism, and unapologetic critiques of religious beliefs. Today's lecture promised controversy. Callaway was famous for his faith versus reason segment, where he dissected religious doctrines, often with biting sarcasm. His usual target? Christianity. As the students settled in, Callaway smirked, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd. He thrived on challenging young minds, making them question everything they knew. But today, he had a special audience member, someone whose presence had drawn media attention even before the class began. Seated in the second row, his expression calm yet observant, was Barron Trump, the 18-year-old son of the sitting President Donald Trump. Despite his famous last name, Barron had chosen to pursue a degree in business and ethics rather than politics, seeking knowledge beyond the shadow of his father's legacy. The whispers in the hall had begun the moment Barron stepped in. His presence alone was enough to polarize the room. Some students admired him, others resented him, and many were simply curious about his thoughts. Callaway, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to use Barron as the focal point of his most ruthless argument against Christianity. Clearing his throat, Callaway raised a hand to quiet the murmurs. "Good afternoon, class," he began, his voice smooth yet authoritative. "Today, we tackle the greatest illusion of the modern age, faith." He let the word hang in the air before pacing dramatically across the stage. For centuries, humanity has clung to comforting lies. The belief in a divine creator, the notion of miracles, the absurd idea of a benevolent deity controlling our fates. And yet, despite the advancements of science, despite the irrefutable progress of reason, intelligent people, still choose to believe in ancient fairy tales. Some students chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably. Barron remained motionless. Callaway smirked. "And so, I propose a challenge. A simple question that no Christian has ever successfully answered in this class." He turned sharply, eyes locking on Barron. "Would you care to participate, Mr. Trump?" A hush fell over the room. All eyes were now on Barron. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet Callaway's. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his demeanor, something unshaken, unbothered. Callaway pressed on. "You believe in Jesus Christ, do you not?" Barron, after a pause, nodded. "Yes, I do." Callaway grinned, as if he had just been handed the perfect opening. "Excellent. Then tell me, if your so-called loving and omnipotent God exists, why does evil persist? Why do innocent children suffer? Why does war, disease, and famine plague our world while your God remains silent?" The room was silent. The tension was thick. Students glanced between Callaway and Barron, anticipating the young man's response. But Barron didn't react the way they expected. Instead of stammering, instead of fumbling for an answer like many before him, Barron simply smiled. Confident, knowing smile. And when he finally spoke, his words left everyone speechless. The room was so silent that the ticking of a wristwatch in the back row felt like a drumbeat. Professor Callaway stood with arms crossed, the smirk on his lips betraying his confidence. He had posed this question to many students before, devout believers, religious scholars, even theologians, and all had stumbled. But Barron Trump didn't look shaken. In fact, he looked calm, composed, even amused. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk in front of him. Then, with a measured tone, he said, "You assume that because evil exists, God must either be powerless or indifferent. But what if suffering serves a greater purpose, one that we, with our limited understanding, can't immediately grasp?" A murmur rippled through the room. Callaway's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Barron continued, his voice steady. "Think about this, Professor. You claim to value reason and logic. But tell me, can a world without suffering truly cultivate virtues like courage, compassion, and perseverance? Would we ever understand the depths of kindness without first witnessing cruelty? Would we ever appreciate justice without encountering injustice? Calloway blinked. He hadn't expected such a philosophical counterpoint. The students leaned in, intrigued. Barron pressed on. You call suffering a flaw in God's design. But what if suffering is part of the design? One that refines us, strengthens us, and draws us closer to understanding what is truly good. Calloway let out a chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, the classic greater purpose argument. You mean to tell me that a starving child, a war-torn village, or a cancer-ridden mother are just necessary evils in some grand cosmic plan? Barron's gaze didn't waver. No, I'm saying that suffering, while painful, is not without meaning. It's easy to blame God for evil, but tell me, who commits the most evil in this world? Is it hurricanes? Is it earthquakes? Or is it people? Another wave of murmurs. Some students nodded. Others frowned, deep in thought. Barron continued. We shake our fists at God for allowing suffering, but do we ever look in the mirror? When we see hunger, do we feed the poor? When we see oppression, do we fight for justice? Or do we, like many, sit back and do nothing, only to blame God for the problems we refuse to solve? A few students exchanged glances. Calloway, however, was not ready to yield. A nice sermon, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. But you still haven't answered the real question. If God is good and powerful, why allow evil at all? Why create a world where suffering is even an option? Barron sighed. He had anticipated this. Professor, do you have children? Calloway's brow furrowed. No. What does that have to do with anything? Barron leaned back in his chair, tilting his head. Humor me for a moment. Imagine you did. And imagine you had the power to control every aspect of their lives. Would you take away their ability to fail? Would you strip them of their choices, their free will, just to ensure they never made mistakes or faced hardships? Calloway scoffed. That's ridiculous. A child needs to make mistakes to learn. Barron nodded. Exactly. And that's what God has given us, free will. The ability to choose between good and evil. Without that, we wouldn't be humans, we'd be puppets. And a love that is forced is not love at all. Silence. For the first time, Calloway didn't have a quick retort. A student in the back muttered, Damn, that's deep. A few heads nodded. Others frowned, still trying to process it. Barron folded his arms, waiting. He knew this conversation was far from over. Professor Calloway adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, regaining his composure. Though Barron's response was articulate, Calloway had no intention of letting an 18-year-old student outmaneuver him in a debate he had mastered over decades. Clever, Calloway said, his voice edged with amusement. You argue that suffering exists because of free will, a classic theological dodge. But let's set aside human-caused suffering for a moment. Tell me, Barron, what about natural disasters? Earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, things that kill thousands, sometimes millions, and have nothing to do with human free will. He turned to the class and spread his arms. Are we to believe that God allows innocent families to be buried under rubble for some greater purpose? That the drowning of a child in a flood is a divine test of faith? Or will you admit that these disasters are simply the result of an indifferent universe, governed by the cold, merciless laws of physics? A few students nodded in agreement. This was the moment Calloway had been waiting for, the argument that had left countless Christians stumped. But Barron was still unshaken. He tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking for a moment. Then he looked up and said, Professor, do you believe in beauty? Calloway raised an eyebrow. What kind of question is that? Barron remained calm. A simple one. Do you believe in beauty? In art? In music? In love? Calloway scoffed. Of course. Those are human experiences. Barron nodded. And what makes them meaningful? Calloway folded his arms. Subjectivity. Perception. The fact that they exist because we, as conscious beings, find value in them. Barron leaned forward. And yet, Professor, isn't it true that some of the most breathtaking landscapes, the Grand Canyon, the mountains of Colorado, the beaches of California, are the result of the same natural forces that also cause disasters? Calloway's smirk twitched. Barron pressed on. The same tectonic shifts that create devastating earthquakes also carve majestic valleys. The same storm systems that bring hurricanes also nourish the land with rain. The same universe you call cold and merciless has given us breathtaking beauty. Is it possible, Professor, that we only focus on the destructive side because it's easier to blame God than to appreciate the balance of nature? The room was dead silent. A few students sat up straighter, considering Barron's words. Even those who had nodded in agreement with Calloway before now seemed unsure. Calloway, however, was not so easily bested. He let out a chuckle. Balance, you say? Tell that to the people who lost everything in a wildfire. Tell that to the mother who lost her child to a disease. You're dressing up suffering in poetic language, but it doesn't change reality. A loving God would not allow such horrors. Barron sighed. Professor, do you believe in fire? Calloway frowned. What kind of question is that? Barron's voice remained steady. Do you believe fire is good or evil? Calloway hesitated. Neither. Fire is just a natural phenomenon. Barron nodded. Exactly. Fire can destroy, but it also purifies. It can burn down a home, but it can also provide warmth, light, and energy. It depends on how it is used and how we respond to it. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. Maybe suffering isn't just a punishment or a test. Maybe it's a fire, one that refines us, shapes us, and prepares us for something greater. A long pause. For the first time, Calloway had no immediate response. Students glanced at one another, whispering. Even those who had come into the class firmly against faith seemed intrigued. Barron sat back, waiting. The battle was far from over. Professor Calloway took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he searched for a counterargument. His reputation as a ruthless debater was on the line, and Barron Trump had unexpectedly turned the conversation into something deeper than he had anticipated. The students were watching intently. Some had their phones out, subtly recording the exchange. They had expected a one-sided dismantling of faith, but now, it seemed like a genuine battle of ideas. Calloway stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. You're romanticizing suffering, Barron. You talk about refinement and preparation, but let's be real. A child dying in agony from cancer isn't being refined. They're just dying. Where's the meaning in that? Barron met his gaze without hesitation. Professor, you're assuming that this life is all there is. The words sent a ripple through the room. Calloway narrowed his eyes. Ah, I see. Now we're moving into heaven and the afterlife. The ultimate religious cop-out. Don't worry about the pain now because there's a magical paradise later. He scoffed, shaking his head. That's not an answer, Barron. That's wishful thinking. Barron smirked. Is it? Or is it just as valid as your belief that when we die, we simply become dust and nothing more? Calloway folded his arms. That's not a belief, that's science. Consciousness is tied to the brain. When the brain dies, consciousness ceases. There's no evidence of an afterlife. Barron nodded. And yet, for all of human history, across every culture, in every civilization, people have had an innate sense that this life isn't the end, that there's something beyond death. If your position is true, Professor, then why does the idea of an afterlife persist so strongly, even among people who have never met? Calloway scoffed. Because people fear death, Barron. They invent comforting stories, so they don't have to face the cold, hard reality. Barron tilted his head. Or maybe, Professor, it's the other way around. Maybe we fear that there is something after death, something we'll have to answer for. A hush fell over the room. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. He had faced many Christian students before, but none had turned the argument on him like this. Barron continued, You call it wishful thinking, but I could say the same about atheism. What if your belief that death is the end isn't logic but simply your way of avoiding the idea of judgment? The idea that maybe, just maybe, we don't get to live however we want without consequences. Several students leaned in, intrigued. Calloway let out a short laugh, shaking his head. So now we're at the fear of hell argument? You're trying to scare me into belief. Barron shook his head. Not at all. I'm saying that the idea of an afterlife, whether it be heaven, judgment, or something else, isn't necessarily comforting. In fact, it's terrifying if you think about it. Because it means that what we do here matters. That we're accountable. That justice exists beyond human courts. A silence stretched between them. Barron's eyes met Calloway's. Professor, I don't expect you to believe in God just because of this conversation. But let me ask you something. If you're so sure that there's nothing beyond this life, why do you seem so angry at the very idea of God? Calloway's smirk vanished. For the first time, he hesitated. The students felt the shift in the air. Something was happening in that lecture hall that no one had expected. And Barron Trump had just put the professor on the defensive. Professor Calloway's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. His usual confidence wavered, just for a moment, but enough for the students to notice. Barron's question had struck something deeper than just intellectual debate. A nervous chuckle escaped his lips. Angry at God? That's absurd, Barron. How can I be angry at something I don't believe in? Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze unrelenting. Then why do you spend so much time mocking him? The room was still charged with tension. A few students exchanged glances. Calloway had built a reputation for tearing down religious beliefs with relentless precision. Yet now, for the first time, it seemed like someone had turned the microscope on him. Calloway let out a breath and shook his head. This is just another trick. Another way for believers to avoid answering the hard questions. He straightened up, regaining some of his composure. Let's bring this back to reality. You've talked a lot about suffering having a purpose, about free will, about some grand divine plan. But let's get practical. He stepped away from the podium, pacing. Since you love philosophy, Barron, let me ask you this. If Christianity is true, if Jesus is real, if God exists, then why do so many so-called followers of Christ commit horrible atrocities in his name? The Crusades, the Inquisition, corrupt pastors who steal from their congregations, priests who abuse children. He turned sharply, facing Barron. Where was God in all of that? A few students nodded. Some leaned forward, interested in Barron's response. But Barron didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, as if he had been expecting this. Professor, I could ask you the same about atheism. Calloway blinked. Excuse me? Barron leaned forward, his voice calm yet firm. Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot. The most murderous regimes in history were built on atheistic ideologies. They banned religion, they persecuted believers, and they justified mass killings under the banner of reason and progress. Silence. Calloway's jaw tensed. Barron continued, the problem isn't Christianity or atheism. The problem is humanity. Evil people will twist anything, religion, science, philosophy, to justify their actions. But the failures of men do not disprove the truth of God. Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose. That's a convenient excuse. Barron shook his head. It's reality. You blame Christianity for the failures of some, but you don't apply the same logic to atheism. Why the double standard? A few students murmured in agreement. Calloway seemed taken aback, but he quickly masked it with another smirk. All right, he said, trying to shift tactics. Let's set history aside. Let's talk about you, Barron. You're a billionaire's son. You grew up in luxury. What do you know about suffering? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some students smirked, thinking Calloway had finally found a weak spot. But Barron's expression didn't change. He took a deep breath. I've seen suffering, Professor. Maybe not in the way you expect, but I've seen it. He looked around the room. I've seen how money doesn't fix broken families. I've seen powerful men fall apart because they chased everything except what actually matters. I've seen people who have everything but are completely empty inside. The room was quiet. Barron's voice softened. Pain isn't just about poverty or tragedy, Professor. Sometimes, the worst suffering is feeling like nothing you do will ever be enough. Calloway's smirk faded. For the first time, it looked like he had nothing to say. And for the first time, the students weren't just listening. They were feeling it. A deep silence hung over the lecture hall. The usual rhythm of Calloway's debates, where he effortlessly dismantled the beliefs of his opponents, had been broken. Instead of watching a young man struggle under intellectual pressure, the class was witnessing something entirely different. Barron wasn't just holding his ground. He was changing the conversation. Calloway swallowed hard, stepping back toward the podium. His voice, though still steady, had lost its sharpness. "So, you've seen suffering in wealth," he muttered. "Fine. But you still haven't answered my question. If God exists, why does he allow evil?" Barron exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Because if he didn't, we wouldn't be free." The words cut through the room like a blade. Calloway furrowed his brow. "What?" Barron leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "God doesn't stop evil because real love, real goodness has to be chosen, not forced." Calloway scoffed. "That's a convenient excuse." Barron shook his head. "It's the only answer that makes sense. Imagine a world where God stops every evil act before it happens. No theft, no murder, no war. Sounds nice, right?" A few students nodded. Barron continued. "But in that world, what happens to free will? If we're forced to be good, then it's not really good anymore, is it? It's just programming. A robot can't love. A puppet can't be virtuous." Calloway narrowed his eyes. "So, you're saying God allows evil so that we can have the illusion of choice?" Barron shook his head. "Not the illusion, the reality. Real love, real goodness, means having the ability to choose evil and rejecting it. That's what makes it meaningful." The students were dead silent. Even those who had come into the class with no interest in faith were suddenly listening. Barron continued. "God doesn't stop evil because that would take away the one thing that makes us human, our ability to choose." Calloway pursed his lips, but he didn't interrupt. Barron's voice softened. "The real question, Professor, isn't why God allows evil. It's why so many people choose it." Calloway let out a slow breath. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to wonder, was he debating to win? Or was he debating to avoid something he didn't want to confront? He forced a smirk. "That's a poetic way to put it, Barron. But it doesn't change the fact that billions of people suffer because of this so-called free will. That doesn't seem like a loving God to me." Barron met his gaze. "Maybe love doesn't always mean stopping suffering. Maybe sometimes love means walking through it with us." The professor stiffened. Barron let the words settle before continuing. "And that's the whole point of Jesus." The room was still. Barron's voice didn't waver. "Every religion in the world talks about humans trying to reach God. Christianity is the only one where God comes down to reach us." Calloway's smirk was gone. He looked down at his notes as if searching for something. Some argument, some clever response, but nothing came. Barron leaned back in his chair. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. The debate was shifting. And for the first time, it wasn't Calloway who had control of the room. The weight of Barron's words lingered in the air. For the first time in his long teaching career, Professor Calloway found himself struggling to respond. His entire persona was built on the idea that faith was irrational, that science and logic had left God in the past. Yet, here was a young man, barely out of his teens, who wasn't crumbling under his questioning. More than that, Barron wasn't just answering. He was challenging him. Calloway forced a chuckle, though it lacked its usual sharpness. "All right, Barron, you've made your point. Christianity offers a comforting answer to suffering. But let's talk about something else." He crossed his arms. "Jesus, you say he's different from all the others. But how do we even know he was real? How do we know the Bible isn't just a collection of myths?" A few students nodded. Some, who had remained skeptical, seemed to regain their confidence. This was familiar territory. The Jesus is a myth argument was a common one, and surely the professor would take control again. But Barron didn't hesitate. "Because history says so." Calloway frowned. "History?" Barron nodded. The existence of Jesus is one of the most well-documented facts of ancient history, not just in the Bible but in Roman records, Jewish historical accounts, and writings from non-Christian sources like Tacitus and Josephus. Calloway blinked. Barron continued, even atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman acknowledge that Jesus was a real historical figure. The idea that he was a myth isn't taken seriously by historians. It's just something people say on the internet because they don't like what it would mean if he was real. A few students looked at each other, unsure. Barron leaned forward. So the question isn't whether Jesus existed. The real question is this. Who was he? Calloway let out a sharp breath. A preacher. A revolutionary. A man who got himself killed by the Romans. Barron tilted his head. Then why did his followers die for him? Calloway's jaw clenched. Barron didn't stop. People die for lies all the time, Professor. But they don't die for something they know is a lie. Calloway frowned. Barron's voice was steady. If Jesus' resurrection was fake, then the disciples were the ones who faked it. They would have known it wasn't true. And yet, they were tortured, beaten, crucified, and killed, all while refusing to deny that they saw him alive. The room was silent. Barron's eyes met Calloway's. Would you die for something you knew was a lie? Calloway swallowed hard. The students could see it. For the first time, their professor, who had made a career out of dismantling faith, had no answer. Professor Calloway's fingers tightened into a fist at his side. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, watching, waiting. His usual debates followed a predictable pattern. Religious students crumbled under his questioning, their faith exposed as nothing more than wishful thinking. But Barron Trump wasn't crumbling. He was pressing forward, steadily, like a man who had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. Calloway cleared his throat. So, you believe Jesus rose from the dead? Barron nodded. I do. And so did his followers, to the point that they died for it. Calloway scoffed. That doesn't prove anything. People die for all sorts of things. Martyrs exist in every religion. It's not proof of truth. Barron smiled slightly. True. But there's a difference. Calloway frowned. Barron continued. People die for things they believe to be true. But the disciples weren't just dying for a belief. They were dying for something they claimed to have seen. The room was completely still. Barron leaned forward. Think about it, Professor. If Jesus never rose, then the disciples would have known it was a lie. But instead of breaking under pressure, instead of admitting they made it up, they went to their deaths, one by one. Would you let yourself be tortured and executed for something you knew was a hoax? Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. Barron didn't stop. You're a man of reason, Professor. If someone told you they saw a miracle, you'd be skeptical. That's fair. But what if not just one person claimed it? What if hundreds of people, eyewitnesses, were willing to die rather than deny what they saw? Calloway's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Barron's voice softened, yet remained firm. That's why Christianity didn't die when Jesus was crucified. It spread, not because of power or force, but because something happened. Something so real that men who ran away in fear before were suddenly willing to face death with courage. A few students murmured among themselves. Others sat frozen, caught in the tension between Calloway's silence and Barron's quiet conviction. Barron sat back. So, Professor, if you want to argue that the resurrection never happened, fine. But you have to explain something. He locked eyes with Calloway. What changed those men? Calloway inhaled sharply, his gaze flickering toward his notes as if searching for an answer. But there was none, because for the first time the question wasn't just about logic. It was about truth. And truth had a way of demanding an answer. The lecture hall felt like a courtroom where the judge had no verdict to give. Professor Calloway's usual air of intellectual dominance had cracked, and everyone could see it. Barron Trump sat calmly, his hands resting on the desk, waiting. He wasn't pressing the professor, he didn't have to. The silence itself was pressing him. Calloway let out a forced chuckle. So, that's your argument? That a handful of ancient fishermen dying for their beliefs proves Christianity? Barron tilted his head. No, Professor. It's not just about them dying. It's about why they died. And it's not just a handful. Over 500 people claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. Calloway shook his head. Hallucinations. Mass delusions happen. Barron raised an eyebrow. 500 people, over 40 days. In different locations? Hallucinations don't work like that. Calloway exhaled sharply. Look, people throughout history have believed all sorts of nonsense. I still fail to see why this particular story should be taken seriously. Barron leaned forward slightly. Because it changed the world. Calloway froze. Barron continued. The Roman Empire, the most powerful civilization at the time, tried to destroy Christianity. Instead, within 300 years, it declared Jesus as Lord. A handful of persecuted nobodies brought the empire to its knees. Not through war, not through politics, but through truth. Calloway clenched his jaw. And that's why you fight so hard against him, isn't it? Barron's voice was steady, not accusing, just knowing. Calloway flinched. Excuse me? Barron didn't waver. Jesus isn't just another myth to you. If he was, you wouldn't care. You wouldn't spend your career trying to tear him down. The room was utterly silent. Some students turned to look at Calloway. They had never thought about it like that. Barron's words hung in the air. You don't fight against what isn't there. Calloway's hands gripped the edges of the podium. A flicker of something, uncertainty, flashed across his face. But then, just as quickly, his familiar hardened expression returned. I teach reason, Barron, he said, though his voice was quieter now. That's all. Barron didn't push. He just nodded. Calloway took a breath, trying to steady himself. He needed to end this. But before he could, Barron spoke again. One last thing, Professor. Calloway hesitated. What? Barron looked around the room. If Jesus really was just a dead man, why is he still the most debated, most controversial, most talked about person in history? Calloway had no answer. And deep down, for the first time, he wondered if he ever would. The weight of Barron's final question hung over the room like a storm cloud. Every student felt it. An invisible force pressing on their thoughts, demanding an answer. Professor Calloway stood at the podium, gripping its edges as if to steady himself. For the first time, he wasn't just debating. He wasn't just countering arguments. He was confronting something within himself. A muscle twitched in his jaw. History remembers all kinds of figures, Barron. Jesus is just one of many. Barron nodded. Then why does he still divide the world? Calloway swallowed but said nothing. Barron's voice remained calm. Why do people still love him or hate him? Why do some dedicate their lives to following him, while others dedicate their lives to destroying him? Why do you, Professor, feel the need to fight against someone you claim doesn't exist? Calloway's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to respond. But the words never came, because Barron wasn't just debating him anymore. He was unmasking him. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Some students exchanged glances. Others stared at Calloway, waiting for the sharp retort that never arrived. For the first time, their brilliant, unshakable professor had no comeback. No witty remark. No clever dismissal. Just silence. Barron exhaled softly and leaned back. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't smug. He was simply done. And that was what made it even more powerful. Finally, Calloway cleared his throat. His voice was quieter, almost hollow. Class dismissed. A ripple of movement broke through the stillness. Chairs scraped against the floor. Students gathered their books, their laptops, their thoughts. But no one spoke. As Barron stood, Calloway's gaze flickered toward him. For a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to say something. A question? A challenge? But instead, all he said was, "You're different from the others." Barron didn't gloat. He simply nodded. "I'm not different, Professor. I just know who I belong to." And with that, he turned and walked away. The students filed out, whispering among themselves. But Calloway remained. Alone. The once mighty skeptic stared down at his notes, words blurring before his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the podium. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure of anything. And for the first time in his life, he wondered, what if I've been wrong?